Who am I? My spiritual journey thus far. I began my journey with religion, specifically Christian story. Now, it'll become more obvious why I use the word story later on, but that's not super important right now. The important thing is that I wasn't raised traditionally Christian. My family, and especially the most influential, my mother, was more of a spiritual person. She used her own heart and mind to interpret the Bible and religion rather than relying on the priesthood. And this really had a big influence on how I began to use my own heart and mind to interpret the Christian story and the Bible later on in life. Actually fairly early, not even so much later on. As a child, I started reading the Bible for myself, and I didn't really agree with other people's view of it. So that kind of started me off as almost a countercultural Christian in a sense, because I didn't really want to listen to other people's points of view. I wanted to come up with my own model of what God was saying in the Bible. And this led me to questioning Christianity and religion. This led me to eventually realizing that I didn't believe the Bible and Christianity as a literal truth, that it was what actually happened throughout human history. Now, I can't say for sure because I wasn't there, but it doesn't add up to me. And so I started listening more and more to the input of atheists and scientists and people who belong to more of a counterculture within Christianity and religion. And that kind of led me to science and the occult. So I think that science and the occult belong in the same category, at least for me personally, because they both take a similar approach. A lot of it is based on evidence and tangible results. So if you think about science, the scientific method is very much about hypothesis, experimentation, result, right? The occult is very similar if you're looking at it from an open-minded spiritual point of view. So I'm not looking at this from a academic point of view. Obviously, the occult would be considered way beyond pseudoscience, but from a purely intellectual view of trying to understand reality with this being my starting point, right? If I had started with science, I would have probably never thought of the occult as something that should be taken seriously. But because I started with Christianity and religion, transferring over to the occult was sort of a step toward a more scientific method. Because if you think about what the occult is, a lot of the occult is about saying, if you do this, then you get this, right? That's what sort of classical magic with a K is. It's the idea that if you follow this formula, right, that you will get a specific result. If you cast a certain spell, or if you listen to a certain spirit in a certain way, or something like that. It's different from faith, right? The Christian and religious method is usually very faith-oriented. And I wanted to get away from faith because I was trying to, again, based on how I was kind of trained as a child, I wanted to use my own mind, my own intellect to interpret reality. And faith just wasn't going to work for me. I wanted actual answers. I wanted something more tangible, right? So that's what led me to science and the occult. And I experimented with both those for quite a while, and I still incorporate both of those as well as religion into my beliefs. But ultimately, I found that both of them fell short in different ways. The occult, and I include in that things like alchemy, right? Which is, if you think about it, the early basis for a lot of science was the sort of an occult interpretation of religion, right? The attempt to turn religion into a form of science. The occult was kind of the bridge between those two, so you can see the attraction. But anyways, I found that science had its own sort of, I don't want to call it faith, but its own sort of limitations. And I did not like those limitations because to me, science was unwilling to look at anything beyond what could be physically measured and experimented with. And to me, I wasn't just trying to understand the physical universe. I was trying to understand everything. And to some people who are much more scientific than I, they would say, well, what do you mean just the physical universe? That's all there is. And I would definitely disagree with that. That's likely in part due to, again, my coming from a religious history that I automatically have this default mindset of there's more than just the physical world. That's what I was taught. But it's not just a bias for me. It's also my real belief, my rational belief that there is more than just the physical world. You can call me a panpsychist or a pantheist, whatever you want to. But the point is that I don't just believe in physical reality. So when I run into the limitation within science that if it can't be done in an experiment, then it's not worth talking about, right? I don't like that. I can't relate to that because most of what I am interested in, things like, is there a God? And what is the true meaning of life? What happens after death? These sorts of things can't be measured through direct experimentation. And so I found that science was useful, right? We get technology from science. Science should not be shunned or looked down upon because what it does extraordinarily well. And for that reason, I will always incorporate as much science as I can into my understanding of reality and my beliefs. But that being said, because I want to incorporate much more than just the physical reality, I had to move on. And as far as the occult goes, I would say it failed in a different way because everything the occult promised, it didn't really deliver for me. And if you think about what science does, it does deliver, right? So it delivers, but it delivers because it's aiming kind of small. And I know that sounds kind of insulting to scientists because there's so much that they understand and so much they're trying to understand. But to me, when you're thinking about what can exist beyond the physical reality, it does make their scope kind of small and limited compared to what I want to understand. But at least they deliver on their promises, right? At least they can show you results. Whereas with the occult, I found that the occult was much more subjective than science being objective. And to me, the occult and the study of magic and things like that resulted in me realizing that, okay, so the people who are trying to make these more scientific claims about spirituality, like, okay, if you do this spell or if you meditate in a certain way, you'll get these superpowers or whatever the case may be. That didn't happen, at least for me. And I seriously question anybody who does claim it happened for them, any of the gurus or, the prophets or anybody who says that there's something supernatural that they are physically capable of doing. I say prove it. And with that, I am definitely in agreement with science, where I think that if you're saying it's something happening in the physical world, then that makes it an experiment, which means it's within the realm of science, and you should have to run that scientific gauntlet of the scientific method and prove it. And I think that the occult kind of tried to be too many things. It tried to be science and religion at the same time, tried to be science and spirituality at the same time, and I think it failed at both. So I kept science, and I kind of got rid of the occult up to a point. What I took away from the occult was that the subjective nature of the occult was still extremely useful to me, but in a different way. It was useful in the sense that I understood the occult to be more about philosophy and psychology, because these things have more to do with subjective yet rational interpretations of reality, right? So this is the abstract. It's looking at things like when you look at psychology, and you think about magic, a lot of magic has to do with your own mind, right? And I think that a lot of people in the occult community, in my opinion, fail to respect the barrier between the internal and the external reality. And I'm not saying that there's no transmission between the two. I'm not saying there's no ability to travel between the two or to interact. But what I'm saying is that I think what the occult was really trying to do, similar to how alchemy was becoming, chemistry, I think what the occult is trying to do was ultimately what would become psychology. Because when I think about something like meditation, right? Rather than thinking, oh, well, if I meditate enough, I'll have these superpowers, I don't think that's what meditation does. I don't think that's what magic does. I don't think that's what astral projection is. If you think about astral projection, you compare it to, say, for example, a dream, it's an exploration of your own subconscious. If you could astral project into the physical world, the simple way to scientifically, again, I firmly believe that as soon as you make a statement about physical reality, you should have to prove it in physical reality. So the second that you say something like astral projection is real and it's happening in physical reality, well, then I'll tell you what, it should be pretty simple to prove that, right? You go sit in one room and astral project, I'll go sit in the other room, and you write me a note, right, when you astral project. But guess what's going to happen? When you astral project and you imagine that you're walking over to me in the other room and you write a note on a piece of paper, I'm not going to see that note because I'm not experiencing your subjective mind at that time. Only you are. Just like a dream, right? I can't enter your dream with my mind because your dream exists only in your mind. And that's another aspect of science that I don't think I can fully ever appreciate, is that the science can't really penetrate the mind. It can look at the brain, which correlates with the mind, but science can't ever look at the mind and say, we have objective proof that it exists. No, the only proof that you have that the mind exists is your own subjective experience. And so I think that, going back to astral projection, if we look at the idea of astral projecting into the other room, of course you're not going to be able to physically write that note on a physical piece of paper for me to physically see in the other room. You're going to be writing it inside of your head, just like you do in a dream, right? So instead of throwing that out completely and saying, oh, well, the occult and science are useless, I kind of transfer them, and you'll see a pattern here about how I'm moving around this little circle here, diagram that I've got at the center, and I'm moving toward, the final conclusion, which we'll get to in a moment. But the next step is that I turn science into philosophy. And what I mean by that is, what I took from science was that logic is very valuable, right? Because while science is all about the process of the scientific method, philosophy attempts to apply something similar, kind of how math does, where it allows it to be used in a more abstract and open-minded field or realm, where I can talk about things like, okay, does God exist or not? Well, let's talk about it logically. So instead of being limited to, well, can I physically measure God? No, then he either doesn't exist or it's not worth talking about, right? I don't like that answer. But I also don't want to give up on this sort of rational approach of science that takes things seriously and says, I'm not just going to have faith, right? I'm not just going to rely on, well, this person told me so, or it's written in this book, and so I believe it. That's too emotional for me. It's not logical enough. So I kind of narrowed science and what I like about it down to logic. And then I took the occult and narrowed that down to psychology, right? Which is essentially the subjective mind, right? Understanding the self and understanding the mind and how it interacts with the reality, that separation between the internal and the external world, and that there's a lot of blending between those two, and that they might not be as separate as we think they are, right? Like if you think of any sort of experience, the stimuli begins on one end and then permeates that barrier between the two realities into the other. So say, for example, if I have if I smell something, right, that smell starts externally, goes through my sensory perception, like my nose, and then ends up as an impression internally. No one else can directly experience that impression. So I've translated, right? I've translated the external and the internal into each other. And that's what I think psychology is, essentially, is understanding that process and how it works. And so now I kind of got to a point where, okay, I can play in this field, right? So I still have the ability to think wide, right? This is thinking about the entire conception of reality, not just the physical reality, but also the mental reality. And then we've got the taking of things seriously, right? Where I don't want to just have faith. I don't want to just say something and then not prove it. I want to be able to at least back up what I say. And I also want to look at reality in a very serious way, where I'm taking the steps to understand it, right? Something that always really bothered me is that people in religion talk about loving God, right? And to me, when you love something, you understand it, right? And so it always really bothered me on a deep level when people would say, oh, I love God so much. And I would say, oh, well, what do you think about this, part of the Bible that really makes God look like a bad guy or a bad being or whatever you want to call him, or it, or her. And people would say like, oh, well, I didn't really read the Bible. And it's like, wait. So essentially what you're telling me is that you love this being, this whatever you want to call it, with all your heart, and yet you didn't even take the time to read their autobiography, essentially? Like, that to me seems ridiculous. And so this attempt to love God is carried over into everything else I've done. And that's what I appreciate about science and the occult or philosophy and psychology, is that to me, that is the basis of truly loving God in life, is the attempt to understand. If you were in a romantic relationship and you said, I really, really love my partner, but I don't want to listen to them talk about themselves. I don't really want to get to know their habits or their beliefs or their emotions, their internal world. I just want them to play this role in my life that makes me feel more comfortable. That's how I view faith, is that it's just make me comfortable. I don't really want to know you. And that bothered me. So I got away from religion and I went towards science and the occult, and I ended up with philosophy and psychology, where I could actually get to know the universe, not just the physical universe, but also the abstract universe, the emotional universe, the imaginative universe, right? And then all of that brought me to where I am now, which is art and mysticism, right? So art is essentially the interpretation of reality through your internal experience of it, right? That's art is effectively exporting your internal experience of reality. So if you think about how we know that someone else's consciousness exists to the degree that we do, to the degree that we believe it, it's based on their exportation of that internal experience. So what I'm saying to you right now, describing who am I, this is me exporting through this visual art and through my language, which is another form of art, what I am, who I am, what my experience has been, and where I believe it's going. And so this is not just about understanding, it's also about communicating and communing. And that's where mysticism really comes in. So art is really, the way I interpret it, is expression of the subjective experience. And then we have mysticism, which I would really say is the direct experience of the divine. And to me, once you start to understand all of this on a logical level, right? Once you start to understand your model of God and the universe and the human mind and the human heart and the soul and nature and all these things that are vitally important to having a sort of narrative about reality and yourself and your place within reality, once you start doing that, you're getting closer to what I interpret personally as God, getting closer to the whole, right? And so the mystic experience to me is an experience of the whole. And art is an attempt to understand and express the whole self and others through their art, right? So this is really what I want psychology and philosophy to do, is I want to use psychology to understand myself, to be able to communicate myself to others, to understand others, and to be able to truly understand and appreciate them, just like I was trying to understand God, right? God is in everyone. God is in all of us. We are all God, in my opinion. Again, you can call me a pantheist or whatever you want. But the bottom line is that the deeper you understand anything, the closer you are to seeing God. That's kind of how I view it. And so by applying these sort of techniques, I guess is what I would call these two, by applying these techniques, you get to this section, for me at least, where it's more about the appreciation, right? Art is an appreciation for something. It's not just looking at it as an objective thing. It's not just saying, okay, this chemical and this chemical combine, or this logical statement is valid. It's not doing that. It's saying, how does this make me feel? How do I connect to this on a very personal level? What does it mean to me? And what do I mean to it? Right? So this is where I'm at really right now. And now that I'm here, I'm going back to complete the cycle of reinterpreting everything through this lens, right? So this is my lens that I'm interpreting everything through, that I'm viewing it and emotionally experiencing everything through, is looking at religion, science, psychology, philosophy, nature, all of it with this sort of artistic, mystical understanding of the whole. And I think that holistic approach kind of allows me to feel more in touch with something deeper and more meaningful. And I think that's what I've always been seeking, and why religion appealed to me as a child, and why I've been on this journey for my entire life, is because ultimately I want meaning. And I think art and mysticism are really about breaking down and understanding and recreating the meaning between the relationships of different aspects of God. And we'll get much more into that later on at another time. So what does rational hope really mean? Well, to me, the rational part means that I'm going to be logical, right? So if you think about it, that's this and this, right? The steps that involve this concept of really trying to understand things on a serious level. I don't want to mislead myself or others. I don't want to make huge statements that I couldn't back up if someone asked me to explain. But at the same time, I'm not saying scientific, right? I am not saying that I am scientific. I do appreciate and love science. I do study science. I read a lot and listen to a lot of scientific speakers. But that being said, I am not a scientist, and I'm not attempting to be a scientist. I will not be published in a scientific journal. I am not getting a scientific degree, nor do I possess one now. So please do not look to me as your scientific expert who's going to explain the world of science to you. I will explain science through this lens, right? Through this lens of art and mysticism. So I will talk about science, and I will use logic to interpret science, but it will all be interpreted through this lens, okay? And this is really where the hope part comes in as well, because to me, hope means emotionally connected, right? Because part of the reason why I shouldn't say I left science, but part of the reason why science wasn't satisfactory to me is because it felt empty, right? It couldn't answer the questions that really mattered to me. It couldn't answer the questions that gave me hope and taught me why it's beautiful, right? And even the word beautiful is an artistic word, right? It's not a scientific word. It's much more of a philosophical, psychological word. And those, of course, lead to the artistic and mystic experience of the thing. So to me, hope means emotionally connected in a way that feels beautiful to me. So I'm not just looking for the answer alone. I'm looking for the answer and how to contextualize that. I'm going to write that as well, because how to contextualize the truth within my own experience, right? Because I think that it's kind of silly to pursue a truth without incorporating it into yourself. I mean, it is you who is pursuing the truth in the first place. So how weird and sort of backwards is it to say, okay, well, I know the truth and I don't know how I relate to it. I don't know what it means, and I don't really see why it's beautiful, but whatever, it's true. Like that's such a disconnected way to look at reality, such a purely physical way to look at it, as there's this tangible truth that you just kind of have to accept without really being able to connect with it. So what I hope to be able to promise, and I might break this promise, so I'm not really going to call it a promise, but what my intention is how I'll say it, is that I intend to incorporate my best effort to be rational and logical and to interpret reality in that logical, rational way into a narrative that is emotionally connected to my personal infrastructure. And if you, as a fellow human being, and perhaps a fellow spiritual human being, can relate to my experience of reality in some way, then you too might also be able to benefit from the way that I have attempted to merge or coalesce the rational with the hopeful, the scientific or logical with the beautiful. And that's pretty much all I have to say for today. I hope that helps.